Hello and welcome to another episode of Defence Uncut, the first dedicated English language Pakistani defense commentary podcast where we unpack Pakistani military procurements, events, and broader strategic issues in focused detail so that you can build a clearer and more accurate big picture. So I have with me today Arslan Khan. How are you, Arslan?
Yeah, I'm good. How are you?
Doing well. So let's dive right in. So I think the headliner for this week was the recent visit to Turkey by the Pakistan Air Force Chief of Air Staff, Air Chief Marshal Zaheer Babar. So with that, I think, there are a lot of standard visitation happening between himself and his counterparts or his counterpart in the Turkish Air Force. I believe the Ministry of Defense in Turkey as well. But the big headliner was his interesting visit to Baykar Group's facilities there, where he was incidentally photoed in front of a Bayraktar Kızılelma UCAV or unmanned combat aerial vehicle. I think, these sorts of visits to official sites or official visits to Baykar or Turkish Aerospace facilities by Pakistani officials isn't new, but within the context of the PAF, we know the PAF has an ongoing relationship with this company, with the recent procurements of the Akinci and the TB2 drones, for example, with Baykar previously having an investment within NASTP, but then branching out and forming their own direct subsidiary within Pakistan. So there's a Baykar Group in Pakistan. Basically, they have been on a hiring push as of late as well, getting in, showcasing that they're probably developing a range of solutions for the Pakistani market, potentially anything from loitering munitions to maybe support in, a medium altitude, long endurance platform for the Pakistan Air Force and other implementations. They've been involved with the development of with the PAF, they had developed the Yeeha loitering ammunition as well. So a lot of prior interaction. So I think this particular visit, when we take these other facets of this, of these two entities together, could have some potential teeth to it. But on top of that, we know through I would say about a year and a half ago, the semi-official magazine, Second to None. So, they had worked closely with the PAF. They had like a bit of a feature article on some of the PAF's future planning. In that article, they had revealed the PAF was looking at next generation fighter aircraft. It was going to convert the current Bombardier Global Express VIP jet into a, electronic warfare aircraft. And they also mentioned that the PAF is on the look for, jet-powered, stealthy, unmanned combat aerial vehicles. So, with all that in mind, seeing that the Bayraktar Kızılelma being an option at least shouldn't be surprising. But when we sort of unwind and unpack how this company sort of operates, what their solutions look like, one of the key points about this particular company is that they have a vision that drones would eventually, displace combat or crewed combat aircraft in many operational procedures. They actually do have a view that the UCAV platform, the Kızılelma, would eventually replace fighter aircraft. So there's a lot going on there, and I think it could be a pretty interesting discussion to unwind. So Arsan, what are your thoughts?
Yeah. So when we look at the Kızılelma, firstly, if we take a look at the visit itself, I don't think it necessarily holds a lot of weight, right? And I think it's quite a recurring theme. Something happens and I always start crapping on it, but it's not the first time we've seen these kind of photo ops. However, what is quite interesting is the Pakistan Air Force, the chief has gone and visited Baykar as opposed to, if it was a general industry visit, you'd probably want to go and visit Turkish Aerospace, which is the premier, industry, the premier defense aerospace facility. So that's, I guess, in that front, and also the fact that, as you mentioned, that the Baykar has a massive investments in Pakistan and also has a subsidiary in Pakistan under the name of Baykar Technologies. They've got a long-standing relationship with the Pakistan Air Force, and it's clear that they've been making some sort of push to the Pakistan Air Force for the procurement of the Kızılelma. So I think there's something there. And this kind of ties in well to what we spoke about last time in the previous episode about dwindling fleet numbers. As fighter jets and capabilities get more expensive, a country like Pakistan, and to be honest, most countries, right, they will end up running into issues where they can't meet the same strength requirements that they once upon a time had. You know, if Pakistan Air Force had a requirement for 200 fighter jets, for example, if we're talking 200 fighter jets in the 1950s or the 1960s, the kind of cost you'd be spending then to be able to procure something versus the kind of cost now, as things weapons become more capable, as sensors become more capable, and as we start demanding more of them, the costs start to balloon, meaning we just can't meet those same sorts of numbers. And I think that's possibly an area where the Kızılelma may shine. It's not necessarily going to be cheaper. It might not necessarily be super cheap. And this is something we'll talk about on the next segment. However, it gives you the opportunity to explore other things like risky emissions. And that's something, as I said, we'll talk about next. It allows the PAF to offload some of the burden that it puts on the Mirages and in the next generation, the next generation fighter aircraft. So you'll be able to offload some of the work to the Kızılelma or a similar type UAV, meaning that you are able to perform some of those risky missions without risking crew and without risking even more expensive next generation aircraft.
So I agree with you in regards to, obviously, like these visits in of themselves don't mean much. What I found interesting with the Kızılelma, so there's two parts to it. One is that, Baykar, they focus on a very specific piece within the wider chain here, which is the actual aircraft itself, right? However, a lot of the critical essential guts to really leverage it, like for example the sensor stack, the next generation tactical data link that enables for this like man-unmanned teaming, and also being able to operate in hostile enemy environments with a lot of electronic warfare jamming and all that kind of stuff. That comes from other companies like your Aselsan, like your Havelsan, like your like Millsoft and what have you as well. So I think like what I find the question I have is like, could there be a deeper reason for the PAF's preference with working with Baykar, in the sense that maybe Baykar Group, especially since they have a subsidiary within Pakistan, they might be willing to help out with developing like this, let's say a NASTP led sensor and tactical data link and electronic war, like all those other inputs in parallel to the Turkish one, so that the PAF can actually have its own next generation stack independently. Like, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, it quite well aligns, Baykar's willingness to basically do whatever the PAF wants in effect, and the PAF's own goals and ideas via NASTP. We see a domestic AESA program, for example. That's a big thing being pushed in Pakistan for the JF-17, for the PFX, for ground-based and all that sort of stuff. So that's a massive push. And obviously, we know that the Kızılelma is capable of carrying its own sensors as well. And that's, I guess, as you mentioned, it's something where you could probably see some sort of collaboration where you can start to substitute some of the Turkish avionics and start building around Pakistani avionics, which could, yeah, as you mentioned, be developed with assistance from Baykar. And we see a lot of general other work being offloaded to Baykar Pakistan, kind of similar to what Turkish Aerospace Pakistan did for the Khan program, where they took on some tasks for some developmental efforts, but nowhere near as much as what we see from Baykar in Pakistan. So, there's always the opportunity for them to collaborate further, and particularly as the Pakistan Air Force's requirements increase, as we see the induction of stuff like the Kızılelma. We've done a great episode on next generation data links and whatnot, and it ties in very well to this. And as you mentioned, these kind of systems and these kind of data links and whatnot are really, really like a level above. And I'd recommend you go back and watch that video, because I go into far more detail. But it's a completely different ball game. If right now with Link 17, we have a near real time data link, but the kind of systems we talk about when we're coming on to like stuff like MADL, the multifunction advanced data link, you're talking like infinitely higher data rates. You're talking directional links. You're talking low probability of intercept. Effectively, it goes back to the silent versus the loud we talked about back then, and that's really, really key here. And this is something that Baykar is going to need to develop as part of the Kızılelma. Whether they outsource it or what, I don't know. But the Pakistani NASTP and the Pakistan Air Force has a pretty good relationship with Arslan, Havelsan, and all these lot. So it doesn't seem like it's it's not out of the realm of possibility that we could see a next generation data link being part of a wider deal with the Turkish industry to be able to produce some of these systems at home. Because as I mentioned before, Baykar has a massive production facility in Pakistan. It's being built, it's being constructed. And we don't really see any more like interest by the Pakistani Air Force when it comes to Akinci or the TB2. We don't really see any significant interest from them or any significant requirement. However, what other products does Baykar have to offer in class? I would point towards the Kızılelma. Of course, yeah, Baykar has the Yeeha series and all that, but it's not something that would that would necessitate a production facility of the size being built in Pakistan. We're talking a genuinely huge, compared, maybe not relative to some of the large manufacturers in the US one, but for our region, it's probably quite up there.
So it's worth basically shouting out that, recently Baykar did sign a MOU with the Indonesian Armed Forces to supply this basically the Kızılelma to them. So I think at some level they have decided that they're now ready to go beyond just like marketing and promote and demonstrations. They believe they can now essentially take this product and put it into production. Another point with regards to Baykar's facility within Pakistan is that they are going on a relatively strong hiring spree for those engineers and what have you. So it seems like whatever project that they envision occurring within Pakistan, it would be fairly significant. I know we did see some reports here and there of folks potentially seeing like a TB3 being tested or what have you, but as it stands, it seems that, what I find interesting though is like, okay, with if you recall, like we know the PAF had shown interest or still shows interest in the J35, for example. And now when I think about that is that, my assumption would have been that if you were to pursue that, future unmanned teaming architecture, it would make sense at one level to just procure the whole Chinese stack out of the box, right? Because you would assume that when you get the J35, you get the KJ500, you can get like an FN series UAV or what have you. So you would assume all that stuff would just work out of the box, but it comes at the drawback and at the cost of you not necessarily knowing what's within that architecture. You're not controlling it. So, for example, if you want to integrate, let's say, a NESCOM weapon or even a NASTP designed munition or some sort of subsystem, you'd have to, at this level, with what we're talking about is much more complex than what we have right now. You would have to go and request AVIC that, hey, can you open up the system? Can you integrate this for us? And you have to pay either an exorbitant fee or they won't allow it. With this approach, by working with Baykar and essentially, I think even working with Aselsan on the next generation jamming aircraft and what have you, it seems that the PAF, even under the current air leadership, which, I think we've somewhat criticized at times for having a Chinese preference for like in the air defense field, seems to prefer actually taking the traditional, let's develop our original solutions, our original stack approach, even though there might be a risk that it might get complicated, it might take more time. But I think, at least from my angle, it seems that the air headquarters, they still believe in the original solutions approach, right? They're not taking necessarily the Chinese for granted or even the Turks for granted. I think one of the things that, think about it, like if it had been about the so-called simplest solution, it would have arguably been to just go to Turkish Aerospace and, work on the Khan, and you have access potentially to the Anka 3. And then again, it's the same thing. It's out of the box. It should work all together. But I think with Baykar, they're saying, hey, we're willing to work with you on these original solutions, right, that are suited to your needs and will work within your industry. Like, what are your thoughts about that?
Yeah, absolutely. And the other thing I wanted to touch on is actually the Kızılelma brings an interesting possibility to the arena in the sense that it could be a potential way of tiding over the Pakistan Air Force's strike requirements until they have a solution that they're actually happy with in terms of next generation fighter aircraft. One of the most interesting things I've seen recently is actually, I don't know if you've seen, maybe we can link below, but Leonardo is beginning man-to-unmanned teaming demonstrations with the Kızılelma using the M346 LCA. And I think this is quite interesting because it shows you the possibility here that maybe stealthy, low observable next generation deep strike doesn't necessarily have to be from a 5th generation or a 6th generation fighter aircraft. It could very well be a low capability, low cost aircraft controlling something like the Kızılelma and using it to fulfill that requirement. Now, the other interesting thing about the Kızılelma, and compared to other options in the market, is Kızılelma is very capable of operating on its own. It's a complete sensor shooter in one. You've got your own onboard radar, EOTS, targeting, peeling, everything. You've got everything you need on board, and also your internal weapons bay to be able to carry your missiles. So you're able to do everything all at once. Whereas some of these loyal wingman, dedicated loyal wingman solutions, they don't offer the ability to do that. You are reliant on an off-board sensor. They're kind of just like missile carriers. So this is the one interesting thing I see with Kızılelma, is that you are able to operate it as part of a wingman solution or on its own. And coming back to what I said before with the M346, it's quite interesting because this brings a possibility that, for and this is a little bit more broad, but countries that aren't able to access next generation fighter programs could have an avenue to be able to exploit, low observability and stealth aircraft using lower cost aircraft. So, for example, Turkish Aerospace could pitch a solution with the Hurjet and Kızılelma as its loyal wingman to be able to still provide countries with a credible deep strike and a not necessarily fifth generation aircraft program, but a low observable, high capability aircraft which is able to meet those needs. So back to how this applies to Pakistan, however, is we've seen the Pakistan Air Force is not willing to commit to anything yet, which I think is a very, very good decision. If tomorrow the air chief came out and said that we've committed to one program, I'd be very, very concerned, because if we look at, for example, the F-35 program as an example, and there's many criticisms of the F-35, but the one thing you can't criticize is its capabilities. It's a very, very capable aircraft, and with capable aircraft, it's capable and next generation sensors and sensors you've not, you've just developed. It's not something that you've got tons of experience in. These next generation sensors are very, very complex and very, very capable, and with that becomes a lot of teething issues and a lot of problems that need to be ironed out. And if tomorrow the Pakistan Air Force came out and said, we've gone and selected the J-35, we've gone all in on Khan, I would be very concerned, because there will be a period, and this is guaranteed, there's nothing else to say about it. It is guaranteed that there will be troubles with the J-35. We might not hear about them because of the way China is, but there will 100% be troubles with the J-35, because that's normal for everything. There were troubles with the JF-17 Block 1, which is why we saw an incremental upgrade in the Block 2. There was no significant capability gain, but it was kind of like ironing out any issues. So there's absolutely going to be stuff like this with the J-35. There's absolutely going to be stuff like this with the Khan. So going all in on these systems to the tip of your spear, which to start with will be unreliable, is a terrible idea. And I'm very, very glad that the Pakistan Air Force isn't committed to either program or any of the programs. So I think this brings a possible interesting third option where the Pakistan Air Force is able to commit to something like Kızılelma, which will also have teething issues, but you're not going all in. It's not as all in as something like a fifth generation fighter, and you're still able to bring a very decent strike capability to the table. And that's where the JF-17B also comes in terms of manned-unmanned teaming. So we see that Leonardo is now demonstrating manned-unmanned teaming via the M346 with the Kızılelma. So what's to say that as part of a PFX, for example, or a local program with Baykar, that we can't see manned-unmanned teaming being demonstrated with the JF-17B and the Kızılelma, giving the Pakistan Air Force that next generation strike capability now or within the near future, as opposed to waiting for a Khan to be ready in 10 years or 15 years, or waiting for a J-35 to have all its issues ironed out in the next 5-10 years as well.
I agree. So you know what? I was taking a look at this. I was taking a look at the source that you had released or you provided for the Leonardo and Baykar man-unmanned teaming, and it also mentioned that separately Turkish Aerospace did something similar, where they demonstrated the man-unmanned teaming of the Hurjet with the Anka 3.
Yeah.
Now, when I see two examples like this, with both having Turkey as the common denominator, what that indicates to me is that the actual core architecture piece of enabling this, the next generation data link, which we know from when we document, the only documented example from within Turkey is the Aselsan program. So we have an article on this that goes into it a little bit when the first air-to-air test was done by the Kızılelma. But it seems that this is like multiple signs here. The first sign is that the fact that Leonardo is able to also do this testing indicates that this data link is going outside of Turkey for additional testing and validation work. Number two, it wouldn't surprise me that Turkey or Aselsan has potentially offered this or offered help to the PAF in developing something comparable for their own requirements, right? Hence, now you have Baykar coming in, talking to them, Obviously the PF also is working with Aselsan on the standoff jammer aircraft. I'm not sure if it's going to be the Havasoj 1-to-1. It might be like a custom solution, again, leveraging a mix of Aselsan and Pakistani designed solutions. So what this indicates to me is that which is a good sign, is that this architecture is getting tested in multiple places. It's not just getting single sourced, right? It could potentially even get tested. Like if the PAF was to sign on to some sort of, let's say, developmental deal for the Kızılelma, they might have a couple of prototypes that come into Pakistan. They might start testing it out as well and basically start building around it. So it means that the architecture is moving forward. It is gaining some momentum here, which is a very good sign, because we know that if you look around, definitely, obviously the Chinese have the XS3 and they have their own solutions, but again, you have the same issue of like, it's going to be out of the box. To what extent can you even access the internals of it? But you also know that India is developing their own comparable system as well. Obviously, the timelines for that we don't know for sure, but let's say it aligns, let's say, with their UCAV project. So this stuff is moving. Like, you need to get this stuff moving forward, right? And then having it tied to one all-in platform like the Khan, like the J35 is not a good idea, because again, we don't know how long these platforms are going to take before they're actually ready for combat operations and fully inducted and fully integrated into your system. On top of that, ahead of the next generation fighter, the way I sort of frame the stealth fighter is like, it's the capstone. It's the last piece of the entire, like, let's say, sword or whatever. Like, you still have to build the base of the sword itself, which is like your 4 plus 4.5 fighter aircraft, 4 plus 4.5 generation fighter aircraft for, let's say, defensive air-to-air operations, for building the capacity mass. And I wonder as well, like, the PF might see the UCAV stack, the Kızılelma, as a way of building, as you said, the deep strike capability, but in a more quantitative manner. Because my hunch that one of the differentiators between the Kızılelma and the Anka 3 might be potentially that Baykar is trying to design the Kızılelma to be relatively more cost optimized and cost effective from the onset. Like, they were able to get this prototype going pretty quickly. I think even Turkish Aerospace had like an Anka 3 crash at some point or what have you. So they're going for more complex design, it seemed to me, like something that was more optimized, maybe for like a dual reconnaissance / strike mission.
Yeah.
This to me is like, the Kızılelma seems to be more of a, and I don't want to say expendable. I think it seems to be more of like a platform model around the U.S. Combat Cooperative Air Program, which is the idea was that you would have aircraft that you wouldn't mind necessarily losing. So even though they're capable and what have you, but they're unmanned, you send them out into high risk missions, they get lost. It's not the worst loss to deal with, but they get the mission done. And I think they've modeled their program around that stack, right? So it seems, because you notice how quickly the prototypes came up, you notice how quickly the testing has been going on. You even notice that this is not, like, for Turkish standards, does not seem to be the most controlled technology, right? Like the Kızılelma is being marketed like to everybody, like, basically, whereas the Anka 3 still seems to be, at home under very careful safeguards. So I think there are a lot of factors which are basically pushing this program forward, essentially. And obviously, like, as you said, the demonstration between the M346 FA and the Kızılelma shows that, yeah, you can use like a JF-17B essentially to help basically manage these platforms in that man-unmanned teaming scenario. So definitely there's a lot of interesting potential, but you also raised some uncertainties and risks, and the big one is the engine. Can you like provide some thought on that?
Yeah, so obviously the biggest issue we see with the Kızılelma is it's reliant on Ukraine for engines. Now, that's nothing against Ukraine as a supplier, but obviously, as we know, Ukraine is busy with some bigger issues. And so the assurity of engine supply is something which is maybe a little bit more uncertain, and there's not exactly tons and tons of options available. Maybe you could have something, firstly, there's two engine options for the Kızılelma. You've got an afterburning solution, and then you have a non-afterburning solution. So I think there was the AI-25, which is, I believe, also used on stuff like the L-39. But then you've also got the AI-322F, which is the afterburning engine. And that's kind of like, it's kind of a case of the only other aircraft program, the only in production aircraft program to use this engine was the L-15. Now, that's kind of interesting, though, because it does open up this is a bit of a like weird, not necessarily, a bit out there of a take, where the L-15 was obviously designed around this engine, and then later on the Chinese were able to drop in a domestic engine, which potentially, if Baykar was to, create a custom Pakistan specific solution with the assistance of the Pakistan Air Force, I don't see it potentially being like too out there that we could see a Chinese engined version of the Kızılelma. But that's kind of just like, because there is no other alternative unless the Ukrainians are able to assure some sort of supply, but also assure some sort of support. This is a bit more of like a, so when we this is like an anecdotal thing, but the AI-25 is used on the L-39 training aircraft, and the L-39 was a very popular, was bought in large numbers by like hobbyists and private pilots in the States, and a lot of them would end up swapping out the engine for a Honeywell unit. And actually the Pakistan Air Force also on their K-8s use a Honeywell unit, Honeywell engine, as opposed to the AI-25. So you kind of the ability to maintain and run those AI-25s became a lot more difficult after the war. Now they send them to, I think it was the Czech Republic, for overhauls and spares and support. So clearly, like, there is supply side issues from Ukraine, which obviously I don't blame them for. But the issue is it creates uncertainty for Baykar and also for potential export customers, that there isn't really many options, that they're kind of at the mercy of what the Ukrainians can produce engine wise. Now, this isn't strictly, there is nothing to say that Baykar couldn't come up with a maybe like a license production agreement like the Indians have for the Russian engines, and with Ukraine, to be able to produce these AI-322s in Turkey. Because I do think if the Pakistan Air Force was to go for the Kızılelma, it would be a larger deep strike oriented kind of aircraft, the twin engine afterburning variant. So I think the problem with as with every Turkish program, the problem comes down to the engine and can supply be assured, can supply be guaranteed. And the other thing I just wanted to quickly touch on was, obviously we have the two programs, right, the Anka and the Kızılelma, and funnily enough, they both use the same engines, so they probably also both run into similar issues, unless the Turks end up developing, or they might be already, I don't have it off the top of my head, but they may have a program to replace the engine on the Anka, which we could end up then seeing applied to the Kızılelma. But I think with the Anka, it's very much focused on like a specific role, being very low observable. It's very optimized for that VLO, so for all flying wing, sorry, tailless aircraft. So, it's very, very optimized for that kind of stealth role. Whereas I feel like the Kızılelma is kind of like a mixture, because the Kızılelma is designed for a lot more roles. And as I mentioned, it's also capable of operating in a standalone configuration. I don't know off the top of my head the Anka is or will be as capable in like a standalone configuration as maybe something like a Kızılelma, but the Kızılelma is designed to operate as its own independent fighter aircraft. So there's going to have to be trade-offs. You're going to need to be able to carry fuel and more payload, more mission systems, more weapons, all these things. So there's probably trade-offs there that had to be made by Baykar to be able to ensure that it's able to carry out all the missions that they require of it effectively, or as effectively as possible.
So for what it's worth, Turkish Engine Industries, or Tuşas Engine Industries, is working on two engines basically for the Turkey's UCAV programs. So one is the TF-6000, which is basically your AI-25 non-afterburning, or AI-322 or AI-222 non-afterburning equivalent, and then they have the TF-10,000, which is basically the afterburning one, which is the AI-322 equivalent.
Yeah.
So they have these programs in effect. Obviously, we haven't seen any news of flight testing or what have you. So to what extent and how far they are, that is unknown. So I think like at the end of the day, like let's say there is some movement on this program, it could really just be a start, like a developmental start, even for the PAF. There's still a lot of work that has to be done towards building that next generation air warfare stack. And this is just one very critical piece for sure. But again, like the maturation cycle for this could again extend into the 2030s, right? Like the point is they have to get a start sooner than later.
Yeah.
And I think they themselves potentially within the PAF understood that, look, at the end of the day, like it wouldn't surprise me that we come back here next year and we find out that PFX has been rolled into like a UCAV, which is what we've been suggesting.
Absolutely.
It's literally what we have been saying. Because once you start breaking down how much, number one, the UCAV is instrumental, right, in the future of warfare, especially when your adversaries have like the most dense integrated air defense systems with highly complex, surface or air missile systems, dense jamming, everything basically. Every sort of threat you can imagine, right? Right down to FPV drones coming after you, in addition to their own, Tejas fighter aircraft, in addition to the Rafales, in addition to the air defense systems. So the chances of you sending, when you send a stealth fighter across the border, it's going to be a high risk mission regardless. So even within that context, you would want to buffer that with various types of drones and decoys. So again, the point being is that this is going to take a while to develop anyways. So this could be the very initial phase of that. The second piece I would say is that I think from the PAF standpoint is it's just better just to rely on the Turkish engines for this, because as soon as you bring China into this mix, it's going to create some issues between the Turks and the Chinese. There's no point in getting into that. Number three, if this program gets delayed, then you have the out of the box option, which is to go to China and then buy the J35 stack as it is. But I don't think they're going to go there. I don't think they're going to do that kind of leapfrog. I think they're going to focus on this sequentially, because the point is that they want to build sovereign control original systems, right? The next generation data link, the NASTP design and integrated sensor stack, the ability to integrate your own munitions, air to air, air to surface, like all those things are going to be important, and it's important that they bake all that in the beginning of at the beginning of any project, because once you go from once you start working backwards, like let's say you start with a J35 and you start working backwards, and you're going to run into issues because the OEM is going to say, well, we have our own munitions we want you to use, right? And that's going to be an incentives problem. Whereas with this strategy, you're looking at basically building from the bottom ground up. So I think the point being is that I think the PAF is going to take this slowly, gradually. I don't think they're in any particular rush, because they have other projects to push through the cycle anyways, like additional JF-17s, additional J-10s. Like there's still stuff that has to get done, like a lead-in fighter trainer. Like there's still stuff that has to get filled in. So there's definitely all that. However, one thing I want to call out, and I mean, this is somewhat interesting, is that between Turkish Aerospace and between Baykar Group, you notice that within the Turkish environment, they still don't have like a 2 to 3 ton attritable UCAV design. Like they're still going at with these bigger 5 to 7 ton plus ideas, basically, or not ideas, let's say actual platforms, basically. They haven't gone into like, for example, in the US, you have Anduril and General Atomics to have like 2 to 4 ton UCAVs. There's one project in India in development as well, which could sort of be like the low end, disposable loyal wingman drone, which is basically like a development. It's basically develop up from your cruise missile. So these are like these types of UCAVs. They're basically, I don't want to say direct evolutions, but they draw on a lot of the same core expertise. You basically have to sort of develop them further, essentially. So they're basically slightly bigger than a cruise missile, but they can basically deploy munitions, and they can be recovered, and they can do decoy operations and so on. And I find it interesting that the Turks did not yet develop such a solution. I'm actually wondering, because this would be the easier way, because the engines for this exist already within Turkey, within other markets. Even within NESCOM, you're developing miniature turbojet engines that could potentially be used for this, although it might be a bit of a low powered solution. But nonetheless, I'm also wondering if there's an avenue here for the PAF to co-develop another UCAV, a smaller UCAV, with Baykar Group to help complement basically this entire system.
Yeah, absolutely. We could see something come from, as a derivative of something like the Kızılelma. And I think another actually interesting thing I was looking at, I can't remember whether it was the XQ-58 or not, but there was a rocket assisted takeoff option, and that also that ties into, that could be something that ties into what we saw in May, where and just generally, air forces expect air bases to take attacks. Right? I think it's an interesting gap that's left, and it's not one that the Turks tend to be focusing on much. And I think it may be something more to do with like the markets the Turks are targeting as well. You're not really targeting the kind of forces that already have like a fifth generation fighter structure and setup. Like you're not really targeting those kind of forces. Whereas they're kind of pushing this like independent systems angle as well. Like as I said, the Kızılelma is able to operate independently. So they're kind of pushing also like this angle of like it's an independent system that can operate on its own. So it might just be like an industry thing as well, that they're not necessarily focusing on that kind of solution. But I think actually it brings an interesting point for the Pakistan Air Force, however, to build something in that, 2 to 3 ton MTOW class. The XQ. If you look at the XQ-58, there's you can actually they actually tested jet assisted takeoff option as well, which basically I can't remember whether it was a zero length launch or whether it was a really really short takeoff. But you could, in theory, have like a zero length launch UCAV, 2 ton, 3 ton UCAV that's able to penetrate into enemy airspace. And there's even an electronic warfare variant that's able to be used in the seed role. So there's a couple of options there because stuff like air bases are always anticipated to come under attack. Like it's not new. Forces all around the world have solutions for this. You even have mats which can go over craters, which so you can carry on your operations from damaged runways. So it's not anything unexpected, to take hits on runways. And I think this is where something like a lower weight UCAV could come in, a smaller UCAV could come into play here. Is you're still able to carry out some like deep strike, 2 3 ton MTOW, something like the XQ-58 has a 3,000 mile range or something ridiculous like that. So you're able to carry out a lot of you're able to pack a lot of stuff into the airframe. It's got about a 1,200 pound payload from memory, with half of that being internal and half that being external. So just imagine being able to carry, some light cruise missiles or even other drones as well, and you're able to go deep into enemy airspace and drop them on top of your enemy, or even other mission systems like electronic warfare payloads. It's an interesting gap that's left, and I think it's one that should be explored, particularly as a more like local effort, because it's you're not necessarily needing to develop a lot of the advanced missions. There's no radar on board, there's no electro-optical systems or any like fancy kit, and there's no fancy avionics. It's cool. They're very dependent on other platforms or on like data link or satcom or whatnot. So it's something I think it's like kind of like the next evolution of the male UCAV, or like that type of angle, as opposed to like a loyal wingman, like fighter type angle.
I agree. And thing is, like a lot of the core inputs to do this are available to Pakistan from within Pakistan. So, for
Okay.
example, the Anduril YFQ-44, it uses a single 18 kilonewton thrust turbofan engine, which is the Williams FJ44. Now, you could use two of the NESCOM, like, 4KN engines. Again, it'd be a bit of a low-powered solution, low-powered outcome. But again, like it's not far-fetched to see NESCOM, to see them develop eventually a slightly higher thrust turbojet engine for this kind of application. Like if they can get to 4KNs, they can potentially get to 6 to 8 to 9. Like I mean, it's not infeasible, and plus you do have the wider Chinese commercial market, which you can go into and potentially acquire those anyways. So the point being that you have a design at home, but you're able to sort of build around. So that's one aspect. The other aspect is that if you look at the NASTP slash Baykar joint projects that they have so far, the Kajim V3 seems to really be working towards that direction. Like if you look at the Kajim V3, it literally serves no other purpose. Like it has no reason to be there. Like it's this miniature cruise missile, right? It has like a very basic design. It kind of seems very redundant to the Taimur at this point. It seems very redundant to the Azab series. I know they've sort of marketed it as something that you deploy from a drone, which is fair enough. But I think that there's so much within that design itself. It seems like it's like a stepping stone that you can use as like a basic demonstrator that eventually leads you to something like a Valkyrie, to something like a Fury style platform, essentially down the line. And it's something that, goes back to our earlier conversations at a more structural level. It's something you can manufacture at scale, right, within Pakistan. So like wherever investment you make into this, like the whole purpose of this kind of drone, of this kind of attritable drone, is that you produce them in large numbers, you send them out into a conflict. Yeah, so many of them are going to get destroyed, but then you eventually replace them with a newer version, a more advanced version, and you just keep iterating over time. So then, if you don't find use of them within the conflict itself, then you use them for other purposes, like, as your next generation medium altitude, long endurance UAV for reconnaissance and what have you. Or you start just basically cannibalize some of those components and use them towards your next generation drones. Like there's just a lot you can do with that. So I can see that if whatever possibility you might have with the Baykar partnership, at the bare minimum, you can see them co-developing something like this with NASTP at the bare minimum. But I do think there's more to it than that. But I think like that would be a pretty reasonable starting point.
Yeah. I don't just think that this is the Baykar production facility is going to be, focused on one platform because, Pakistan itself is probably not going to be able to sustain large enough orders to be able to justify that significant investment. So either that means Baykar is looking to set up a parallel production line with Pakistan for international export, or there's even more scope for collaboration beyond what we see already. And as we know, the PFX program is in the works, and the Pakistan Air Force has not explicitly ever told us what PFX is even going to be. I don't see any indication that Baykar has any interest in a manned fighter platform either. And obviously, other than PFX being a fighter and Kızılelma also being a fighter aircraft, there's nothing to say that PFX couldn't be wrapped into a fighter type UCAV, which is able to operate standalone. So, the Baykar investment, I don't think is focused on one system, but I think it's a clear indication of a developing partnership and further industrial collaboration to be able to create solutions not only for the Pakistan Air Force with the Pakistan Air Force, but also to be able to build solutions they've already developed, like the Kızılelma.
I agree. So now bleeding into the next Bayraktar topic. So we have reports of a Sudanese Air Force Bayraktar Akinci downing another high altitude long endurance UAV. It's unclear at the moment what that UAV was. I mean, we've seen quite a few takes on it, everything from it being another Akinci, which I guess speaks to Turkey's, let's say, liberal arms transfer, arms exports policies, or it could be like a Chinese male UAV or HALE UAV, or it could be. I mean, I think the least likely one was this. What some folks were arguing that it was a Rafale, but I don't think. I think you're going to debunk this. It's unlikely because there's no sign of it being a Rafale,
Yeah,
basically.
I think in terms of the Rafale claim, I think it's pretty easy to dip. I mean, we did, the system was used. I think it was the Sungur. It's like a manpad type missile with a small warhead, hit to kill. So it's the kind of damages that you probably lose an engine. And something like the Rafale, if you lost an engine, you're probably not going to fall out of the sky like that did over there. So in the footage, what we see is it looks kind of like the wing takes a hit, or the engine, which could be on top of a wing, takes a hit and sort of snaps effectively, leading into a spiral dive to the left. So, something like the Rafale, I wouldn't really expect the wing to just fall off in half as a result of a manpad hit. On top of that, I know a lot of people are focusing on the closeness of the heat sources to say, that's got to be something with two engines stacked really close together. I don't necessarily think that's the case. If you ever look at like like IR footage of like an airline from behind as well, depending on the type of sensor and the type of wavelength and the modes being used, it could possibly just look like two blobs as well. Two really high intensity circles as well. And actually, there's some pictures of like A400Ms out there on thermal images, and if there's no good picture, but you can kind of see what I mean. It's not necessarily, you're not going to see the shape of an engine, right? And people, maybe they have this misconception that turbines don't really run very hot, but something like a PT6 run at like 750, 800 degrees, which might not be like insanely hot compared to a like a turbojet or whatever, but sorry, a turbofan or whatever. But it's all relative, isn't it? Like, when you're comparing it to the sky, which might be, minus 40, minus 30, minus 20 degrees, and you've got like a 700-degree like a ball of fire, it's going to probably look quite intense, quite warm. So I don't necessarily think it's anything to do with the Rafale. There was the other one as well where people were claiming it might be a Chinese. I forget the designation. It's but yeah, there were people, possibly claiming it might be a Chinese UAV. I don't really think China's exported anything in the class, particularly the system they were referring to. I forgot the name now, which is really annoying. But it was unveiled in 2021. It was clearly it was clearly oriented towards the PLA because we've never seen it be offered for export under like an E designation. Yeah, it carried two podded engines, but again, I don't really think that's very meaningful. It's got massive wingspan. nothing like what we see in the video. And it also has a T-tail, which is nothing like we see in the video. It's quite interesting, actually. And I think we should wait and find out what was actually shot down. And hopefully we can see some wreckage, because it'll be very, very interesting to see what that was. But as of right now, I can't really put my mind to what it is, but I'm very confident in saying it's probably not a Rafale.
So, I mean, we can't comment much more beyond that, but I think you had a couple points here in regards to the role of these turboprop powered HALE UAVs. So, would you like to comment on that basically?
Yeah, so in other news, like we saw the MQ-9 be tested with Saab's LoyalEye, which is a podded AEW solution based off of the area, which I thought was quite interesting. And actually, it's a quite interesting application of these male UAVs, which we are seeing increasingly that they are really not capable of surviving these high, these really contested, hot environments. They're quite they're sitting ducks. They're quite easily taken out, and it's something we'll actually touch on very in the next segment. Is they're quite easily taken out. So we're not really seeing massive deployments of them in conflicts now. Ukraine, I think, has died down with TB2 deployments. The Azeris used them with a lot of success, but also, it's kind of also, Armenia not having the capability to be able to intercept them. But we don't have, a lot of near-peer, high-end adversaries like Iran, like India, they do have the capability to intercept them, and that's something we'll touch on soon with the MP9 losses. But we see these drones are being pulled back from the front lines and being deployed more in like an ISR role now. And I think the LoyalEye is a very interesting solution and a very interesting repurposing of these drones. The Pakistan Air Force has bought, I don't know, there's no clear idea of numbers, but it's not a significant number. But the Pakistan Air Force has procured Akinci UAVs. And while the Akinci was always positioned by Baykar as like a really, really high-end strike capable UAV, and it carried a multitude of sensors, including an AESA radar in the nose, BVR missiles, and basically everything. It just carried everything in effect. But the ability for it to deploy those effectively is obviously we're not. It's not very clear, and we have seen Akincis being lost in places like Sudan, to air defense. And that's where I think the whole idea of repurposing them come into play, and the LoyalEye being a very interesting solution. So what the LoyalEye is, and we don't have any performance numbers, Saab hasn't really told us anything, but what we can see is it's a solution comprising of three pods, two underwing and one underbelly, two underwing pods which probably carry an array each. So they'll scan. Each array will scan on its own side. So you're probably not gonna, you won't have a 360-degree capability, which the area never had. That's based off of an assumption at the moment. And then in the center, you've got what is probably going to be like a data link pod. So it's not something that has to be built into the airframe, and it's something that's modular and can be removed. So it's quite an interesting play on things, right? You've now got potentially a really capable sensor on these UAVs, which would have effectively been sitting ducks in a conflict. And now they could be used as like really, really key enablers to fill like coverage gaps, for example. Like, for example, if you look at this in a Pakistan Air Force context, the Pakistan Air Force has a very significant number of AERIs and airborne early warning aircraft. So it might not even be the best example to use, but for a country that's not got tons of AWACS, actually India might be a good example of this, is India doesn't have a ton of airborne early warning aircraft, and AEW aircraft are really expensive. They're not a cheap asset, and they're very, and procurement isn't easy, and they take a while. Conversions take a while, and sourcing airframes and all this stuff, it's not straightforward or easy. But for someone like India, who already operates high altitude, medium altitude, and high altitude long endurance UAVs, and even the MQ-9, this could be a really interesting solution to be able to fill those coverage gaps in the nearer term, as the program develops, where it's probably something that's going to start being offered for export with MQ-9s, but also potentially on other systems as well. And this is where, if the Turks can, build some sort of collaborative partnership with Saab, it could be a very interesting use of the Akinci, where you've now not only got, AERIs, with personnel on board, but you've also now got your UAVs filling in coverage gaps, or even being used as enablers for like long range targeting over the horizon for the Pakistan Navy's smash equipped boats or coastal batteries. Or the point is if it would basically take what as an asset that wouldn't be very survivable, move it far back from the danger zone, but also allow it to act as a key enabler and give it a really, really important capability to be able to ensure that you're able to fight effectively.
So to be honest, I always expected the Akinci and even like the Wing Loon and these like larger UAV platforms within the PF to basically be primarily ISR platforms. I never understood, even from the beginning, why they were being presented as strike options. Like even if you were to like let's say limit it to the idea of counterinsurgency, counterterrorism operations, like these larger UAVs are pretty costly to operate once you account for the fact that you're not operating many of them to begin with. So
Yeah.
you have like a higher overhead. Yeah, they have their own particular quirks and issues you have to sort of deal with. You have to dedicate, a lot of personnel to them. So it always made more sense that, okay, if you were going to use these HALE UAVs, it would be in the context of a high cost mission application. And that would basically be like things like airborne early warning. So, for example, you can have a situation where within the PAF's case, you can deploy the Akinci with a podded radar system configuration. Ideally, the Saab LoyalEye, and we can get into a bit of the Saab conversation as well a little later. But like you ideally deploy them in concert with your actual crewed ERI systems. You might be able to deploy them a little bit further into the combat situation. So maybe not within the combat environment itself, but maybe your crewed AWACS will operate further back, and this would operate somewhere in the middle to help that AWACS sort of have like a forward node they can kind of relay to and relay back from, and then kind of provide like a bigger radar, like a meshed radar image to your fighter aircraft, for example. And then from there you kind of build on top of that system, so you can have like things like autonomous warfare capabilities for your UCAVs. You can have like other like mesh systems going on with your munitions. Obviously you can have your fighter aircraft's radars speak to each other and speak to this directly, so independently of the pilot. So there's so much stuff, and this goes back to the very beginning of our conversation, is that the importance of building an independent network architecture for this stuff. The reason why you don't want to go for an out of the box solution, whether it's with China or Turkey, is that because you won't be able to do this kind of stuff on your own, right? And I think that's where the potential is, that you want to be able to like plug in different sensor nodes and then build on top of that like autonomous, let's say the nodes speaking to each other, and then have the nodes speak to the munitions and back and forth. So that's where all this stuff is going. Like when we come back, if we were to come back here, if we're fortunate enough, within our PUA headquarters and, wherever, with our nice fancy building in 10, 15 years, we would like talk about this stuff, right? And that maturing. But now in relation to that, you'd mentioned that, look, this is like right now something Saab is partnering with General Atomics, right? Basically to offer, to customers. So, with General Atomics or Boeing? Which one's
No,
the
it is General Atomics and Saab.
to General Atomics? Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So do you see something like the PEF going to Saab and requesting the LoyalEye alongside the ERI ER and other things? And what could be the pressure point for that?
The problem is, and I feel for Saab, is they're in a very unfortunate position now. Is Saab needs to sell, right? That's Saab's job. Is they need to sell, and the problem is there's Pakistan isn't really buying anything at the moment, so they're trying to establish a footprint in India, foothold in India. But the problem is the Pakistan Air Force keeps using their technologies very effectively against the market they're trying to capture, which is a great show for Saab, but it's not buying much favor in India. That Saab is and just to note, Saab has publicly said that they will no longer be supporting Pakistan and providing systems to Pakistan, but we know that's untrue because we know Saab is under the table, continue to sell areas to Pakistan, continue to upgrade the areas of Pakistan. And just to clarify, I don't mean to area ER standard, but there are, yeah, if you have a look at a late batch area and the original batch areas, you will see visible differences on the aircraft in terms of sensors. So Saab has continued to upgrade the systems of Pakistan and continue to supply areas to Pakistan, but also Saab has continued to supply air defense and also, on top of that, electronic warfare equipment. In fact, the GIDS Spider counter UAS system relies very heavily on Saab technologies. In fact, I believe the ESM system is even the Saab Sirius series. So, Saab is continuing to work with Pakistan. They just don't want it to be known so they can get that stronghold in India. And now with stuff like the LoyalEye in the area, I'm sure the Pakistan Air Force would love to get their hands on this stuff. We need to be able to deploy these. We can deploy our Akincis as airborne early warning aircraft, as enablers for long range strikes and for maritime strikes and for ISR and everything. But I think Saab is going to be in a very tough position where they either need to basically at that point write off the Indian market, or find a way to do this stuff kind of under the cover. Maybe if the Turks and the Saab end up partnering up, maybe it's something that can be routed via them. But the point is it's something I'm sure the Pakistan Air Force would love to get their hands on. I think it's just a very politically tricky situation for Saab to navigate. If Saab does end up writing off their adventures in the Indian market, I think they have a guaranteed customer in Pakistan for the long term.
So, I think the PAF would have had a lot more trouble procuring things from a company like Saab, or even for that matter, Leonardo and many others back in like the late 2000s, early 2010s. But as we hit 2020 and onward, it became pretty apparent to a lot of, defense companies, especially within the West, that the Indian market does sway between certain main columns. So, for example, you obviously have the Russians, they maintain a very strong presence there. You have obviously the French that have established themselves quite well, and then you're followed by the Americans, right? And what ends up happening is that a lot of the smaller players that would have banked on the Indian market end up losing out quite a bit. So, a very classic example is Denel Group from South Africa. So I remember, when we first started writing in PUA, I would say, in the years before that, it wasn't uncommon to hear, for example, and I would ask offhand to people like, hey, why doesn't the Pakistan Air Force get the A-Darter? Why didn't we get the Umkhonto air defense system? And this is like, the late 2000s, early 2010s. And the issue was that, they would say, well, the Denel and the South Africans, they're trying to push forward with BRICS. They see a bigger market in India, so on and so forth. And then by the mid 2010s, that didn't work out. They tried pivoting to Pakistan. So in 2017, South Africa signed like this massive MOU with Pakistan on co-developing different technologies. Pakistani officials from NESCOM and SPD basically, visited Denel's facilities. And then around 2018, Edge Group from the UAE bought up all the talent from within Denel, and we weren't able to leverage that. But this is the issue, that Denel essentially, stopped being the South African defense powerhouse because you could argue they had many issues, no doubt, but a big problem was that they banked on the Indian market. They went for the carrots that were being lured, and as a result, they lost the Pakistani market. They lost like the Army's air defense tender to China. They lost the PAF's air defense tender to obviously MBDA in Italy. They lost many other requirements, and there's like a lot of potential that you could have leveraged, especially through the JS-17 program, and all that hollowed out and fell down the floor, and that company went down, right? Saab was a bit smarter in that they kind of caught on to some issues pretty early on. In the heyday of, let's say, keeping Pakistan in the closet, it was about trying to get that fighter tender for the Gripen.
Yeah.
So they were marketing the Gripen to India. They went through like the MMRCA, then they went to the MRFA, and then at the end of the day, the Indian Air Force decided they wanted the Rafale. Then obviously the Indian industry had already had a Gripen level fighter in Tejas. What was the space for the Gripen, right? And then you want to talk about AWACS. Well, India, again, DRDO has a domestic airborne early warning program. Obviously, they have, the Indian Air Force has good relationships with the Israeli industry like Elbit. Again, they can get this kind of stuff from other places. So at the end of it all, the main markets that Saab has in India, I believe, are in artillery, in anti personnel carryable anti-armor or anti-tank weaponry, like the Carl Gustav.
Yeah.
Pretty small things, like not like big things. Like you could argue at this point, at this time, they have a bigger market to defend in Pakistan at this moment, because what's going to happen with the ERI, and this is what we kind of argued in PUA, is that for the PAF, the next phase is to get even longer range airborne early warning platforms, right? So the PAF could approach this, and again, this might have to be done through let's say innovative and creative ways, but the PAF could say, look, we need a global eye level platform down the line to help us build even longer range situational awareness into the Indian side or into our adversary side, so that we can conduct our operations more safely. Because our ERIs, as they are right now, they're in 10, 15 years, they're not going to necessarily cut it for a conventional war in the future, right? So we need like, we have a VIP jet platform. We have, within the PAF, you have the Bombardiers, you have within the PN, you have the Embraers. There's a potential here where you could maybe like leverage Saab's help to develop, I say develop in quotes, to get the ER platform here,
Yeah.
get the loyal, because the thing is, despite Pakistan's fiscal issues and what have you, if they decide that they're going to acquire X, they will put money towards X, and you will secure the X contract. Like, that is like when something is considered non-negotiable, it gets executed, and then that's how the J10 deal was signed. That's how the first ERI deal was signed. That's how the F-16 deal. Like, this stuff gets pushed through the door. That is not something you get within India. Not because India, I think some of them might have been doing this like intentionally to like lure a bigger contract just to sort of dissuade vendors from working with Pakistan. But eventually that stops working, and I think it stopped working. I think even though recently they unbanned Leonardo.
Yeah.
From what I understand, didn't change Leonardo's approach. They're like, we're not idiots, right? We understand what's going on, so we don't care. Like, because at the end of the day, it's like with a lot of these vendors, they have so many other markets, and they know the Indian market, as big of a cash cow as it is, it's very limited to a certain set of favorites.
Yeah.
And if you're not and if you didn't reach that list of favorites before, you're not going to suddenly reach it out of nowhere. Like, and plus the other thing is, Saab structurally, they don't have as much to offer to India directly as, let's say, a France or a French industry would. Because if you notice, a lot of Saab's products, they also rely on external market integration, external market inputs. Like, I don't like there might be some very minor semiconductor work happening in Sweden, but a lot of it gets sourced from Germany and stuff for the radars, right? A lot of like the air platforms that come from different markets, like even for example the Gripen, the flight control system, I think was sourced from the UK. Like, I mean, the point being is that Saab is a very good integrator.
Yeah.
And that is the key. So the Indians would have snuffed this out, and it would just be a very poor business decision from Saab to like jettison the box. Because the problem is, if you're basically an integrator, then nothing stops a Turkey from replacing you.
Yeah.
Like, nothing.
And the one other interesting thing with Saab, and this is just touching back on, well, so firstly, in terms of Saab, if you look at the Royal Thai Air Force and their recent deal with Saab, I believe it was over the Thai, they bought Gripen E's and Gripen E/Fs to modernize their Air Force. And one of the key components of this was that Saab would help them develop a next generation data link architecture, or T-Link. And it was like 130% offset agreement, But so Saab would basically develop a next generation custom data link architecture for the Royal Thai Air Force, linking the Gripens, their airborne early warning, and their naval ships all together, alongside and assist local companies in doing so. And as you mentioned, the Pakistan Air Force could develop, in air quotes, NASTP has their own airborne early warning program. NASTP could, in air quotes, develop an airborne early warning system loosely modeled on the ERI on the global platform, which obviously, as we know, the Pakistan Air Force is now using as their next generation, as the foundation of their next generation jammer, standoff jammer aircraft. So, there are like low noise ways to like approach a lot of this stuff, and I think Saab's expertise in data link and communication architectures would be very, very valuable to the Pakistan Air Force. And also, particularly when we consider that Saab next year intends to fly a fighter-sized unmanned low observable aircraft. So that's, in all likelihood, Saab is probably developing these data link systems and architectures in-house for that kind of application, which is also what the Pakistan Air Force is going to need. Because, when we look at Baykar, it's not something that they're developing in-house, it's something that they're relying on other Turkish vendors for. But for Saab, they can do all of this stuff in-house. So it creates an interesting solution for the Pakistan Air Force. Is the Pakistan Air Force at some point is going to need a next generation fighter. It's also going to need an airborne early warning system that's capable of interlinking with these next generation fighters, but also these next generation nodes like your type UCAVs. And Saab is kind of like one of the only companies, well, if not the only company available to Pakistan that is able to do all of the things that Pakistan needs all at once and by itself without relying on outside assistance.
Yeah, and the other part of it is that this is primarily like knowledge, engineering, expertise work. So it's very hard to, track where that's going, how that's going, right? So a lot of it is like essentially the Saab bringing in expertise to a place like NASTP to help them develop this stuff. And then you have big, or maybe not even NASTP, like NASTP Baykar. Like I could plausibly see like some sort of, let's say, unofficial, unwritten sort of consortium building out here where they just develop the stack, the foundations of it, and then each of them goes their separate ways and sells it to other people, basically. Like it wouldn't surprise me if this is where these things are going because it's going to be in high demand very soon, and obviously there's some big money behind it, and everybody sort of benefits out of it. I think that's a big one. Like whatever Saab would develop with, NASTP and what have you for the PAF and the PN and the Army even. I mean, if you think about it, like the idea of even like integrating an active early warning system into a drone even opens the Army, Pakistan Army up for these sorts of operations, basically, to start leveraging and this kind of solution because they themselves also have an interest in this stuff because they have a growing air
The
defense
Navy as well.
capability.
You know,
Yeah,
it's
like
a
that.
capability the
They
Navy's
have a
had
growing,
for
yeah.
decades. Since before I was born, the Navy's wanted airborne early warning capabilities. And this seems like a very, very easy way for them to acquire this. You know, they're looking to acquire this via the Sea Sultan, which is like a secondary role of it, right? Like the radar, the surface radar is a secondary airborne mode, but it's not going to be anywhere near as capable as something like a dedicated sensor for this, like the LoyalEye. So it's a really like Saab is like has such a like an amazing market opportunity here. Like the tri services would be all over this, and and in reasonable numbers as well. This is like Saab is sitting on like a multi-billion-dollar gold mine here in Pakistan.
Yeah, so in relation to this, and speaking of who else can leverage drones, we have a bit of a thought experiment now. So we're going to move from the news to a bit of analysis. But I'm thinking, look, if the PAF is interested in the Kızılelma, if Baykar could potentially co-manufacture, let's say at least a portion of these within Pakistan and maybe assemble them in Pakistan, could this platform be of interest to another service arm? So, we know that there's been a lot of, let's say, talk and angst on the idea that the Pakistan Navy doesn't have a fixed wing combat wing. And we know that stems from the fact that, hey, this could be overlapping with the PAF. It means setting up a parallel infrastructure for training and operations. How about the alternatives? You lease from the PAF, or the PAF, delegates some capacity to you, which is basically what's happening right now. But could there be a situation where something like the Kızılelma or basically UCAVs as a stack, an entire stack, could be something adopted by the Pakistan Navy to sort of start building out their own dedicated air wings for, let's say, anti-surface long-range operations, basically. Whether it's in tandem with the PAF, I would say like, crewed fighter aircraft would still remain a PAF thing for obvious reasons, but if the barrier to entry towards, let's say, some form of fast jet fighter capability through a UCAV is not as high, relatively speaking, and when you are building a lot of automated platforms to help ensure that there's no, like, let's say, friendly fire stuff happening, let's say no like fratricide risks, you reduce that through automation and AI, so you have all your flying nodes sort of operating within one technical basket, but obviously different service arms own different systems. Could the PN basically one day have a fighter wing through UCAVs?
Yeah, so it's kind of like so it's kind of like how do we approach this? So if we're talking about this in like just the PN looking at procuring some Kızılelmas for a strike wing. I think the PN is making a significant investment into drones, and actually, I have a suspicion that the whole push behind Sharper 3 is quite Navy focused. The Navy is the one pushing a lot more for this. We see a lot of actually systems being developed for the Sharper 3, which are naval oriented. There'll be the Iraq torpedo, Lyric torpedo, there's a Sonoboy pod, they're about ESM systems, which is another Navy developed, Navy pushed system. So, we see the Navy is making a lot bigger push into drones, and it seems like the other service arms are pretty okay with it, particularly the Pakistan Air Force, which kind of throws a hissy fit when we see when other arms start adopting it, foraying into their territory. So, for the most part, it seems like the Navy is focusing on building up this UCAV arm, and I do think the Kızılelma would be a very good, interesting option for the Navy as a strike asset, but also as an ISR asset. And I think that's the key for the Kızılelma, is it acting as an ISR node for the Navy, because the Navy is now inducting very significantly long range strikes, right? Long range fires. So we're the Smash. I'm sure there's going to be further versions, extending the ranges and a lot of stuff, particularly anti-ship ballistic missiles. You really, really need a very well networked node of sensors to be able to ensure accurate strikes, right? Otherwise, you'll be miles off from your target. So you really need these very you need a very well designed network. And I think this is where something like the Kızılelma comes in, because the Pakistan Navy is going to be facing an uphill battle on the surface against the Indian Navy. There's no question about it. The Indian Navy has total surface superiority. Obviously, when we look at the submarines and all that sort of stuff, it's a different matter. But the equation on the surface is very, very heavily tilted in the Indian Navy's favor. And the Indian Navy is a very capable air defense network on board its ships. So for the Pakistan Navy, and we'll touch on this after, is you know you're gonna need something more survivable, and this ties into the sort of MQ Next program, which we'll discuss after. Is I think the Kızılelma or another ISR focused, low observable aircraft with maybe like a secondary targeting function is probably the key for the Navy. But I'd probably even say that the Kızılelma is probably the most ideal platform because it's able to do everything standalone. And something like the Anka has a very low payload capability, and whereas the Kızılelma is able to effectively carry out anti-surface warfare missions, via the Roketsan Som cruise missile. So I think there is a very good possibility of the Navy building up a strike UCAV fleet, particularly via the Kızılelma, as a stand-in for manned fighter aircraft. However, if we were to talk about, something like a drone carrier, which is I think we see quite a lot for people talking about, is why doesn't the Pakistan Navy build a drone carrier? Why don't they buy TV3s and strap them to a ship? And I think that's kind of where we're reaching the limitations of what the Pakistan Navy needs out of drones, but also how we would deploy them and how they would even be survivable in a environment like this. So maybe if you want, Bilal, you can touch on the kind of ship options and that sort of stuff that are available to the Pakistan Navy as a drone carrier, and then I can take back over for actually discussing the drones and the problems we see and the limitations, maybe.
Yeah, so, I think the entire conversation traditionally about getting an aircraft carrier or a drone carrier sort of stems from the Indian Navy has it, why don't we have it?
Yeah.
And that's really not a good reference point to sort of discuss how the Pakistan Navy should adopt procurement. I mean, my personal assessment and view is that the Pakistan Navy should always, no matter what, prioritize submarines and subsurface warfare. That should always be the starting point, and nothing should enter the equation until they believe that their submarine fleet is world class. Like that, I would argue that they should aim for a true world class blue water level submarine fleet in the sense of having a disproportionate number of submarines, being able to deploy boats throughout the Arabian Sea region, even into the Middle East, if need be, to establish a sense that, hey, we can reach you anywhere. Going to the we'll touch on this in later on, but going to that nuclear submarine video that I made, I do believe they should invest in nuclear powered submarines, however long that takes and whatever means they have to use to get there. So I believe the bulk of the investment should always go. I would prefer cutting surface warships if it means supporting the submarine fleet, because that's what's going to deter even the strongest surface fleet from entering your waters. Basically, if they know that there's a very powerful submarine fleet undersea. That's my starting point. Now, that being said, I do think within a context, having a strong surface fleet and then building that towards having amphibious platforms, having a carrier makes sense, but not within the context of India. I think that if Pakistan had developed, and I don't think they have it right now, but if they developed a serious mentality of underwriting Middle Eastern security, I think having a carrier capability of some form, whether it's a drone carrier, which you can. I mean, I don't think it's expensive to even procure a drone carrier because you can have some pretty small solutions from Diamond Group designed one for the Portuguese Navy. It's like a basic drone carrier ID platform where you can deploy USVs, UUVs, and obviously male UAVs like your Anka 3 level, TB2 level, TB3 level drones. So that's there. But I think like, if you could have like a mid-level design, like something bigger than that, but not quite as big as a fighter grade carrier for like for a Kızılelma type fleet, that would be ideal. But from the perspective of establishing presence and force in other parts of the world, to just show people, hey, we can back you up anywhere you are, right? Like you can go to the Saudis and say, hey, we're here to support you with our expeditionary force. We're not there yet. We're so far from that for many reasons, right? But that's the context where that conversation makes sense. So I'm not saying we should do that. I'm just saying that's the context that the conversation makes sense. Like this conversation of carriers should never be put against India, right? Because for India, you need your submarines. And that's the only thing that's when you're up against a bigger power. And this is the thing I want to sort of stress. If you are the smaller power, then you need to lean more on asymmetrical, disproportionate capabilities. So you need to lean more on, loitering munitions, submarines, right? Kamikaze drones. Like, ideally, if you want to be a little ambitious, in that context, you would try to develop XL unmanned underwater vehicles that can double as, torpedo boats and for that kind of stuff. That's the direction you want to go. But when you're the bigger force and you want to establish a capability presence and a sense of confidence amongst your partners and maybe some force projection, then you would invest in a carrier. And that's the reason why India is investing in carriers, right? Like India is investing in a carrier fleet to help establish that presence both within the Arabian Sea on our end and also within the Southeast Asia Pacific Ocean as well.
Yeah, and for now, on the other part of the equation, the actual drones itself, I think one of the biggest things, one of the biggest issues that a lot of drone operators now need to look into is it worth it? Is this like mass procurement of UAVs worth it? And after the Azerbaijan-Armenia war, the TB2 was selling like hotcakes, and then Ukraine also uh, shined a very good light on it, and it was again selling like crazy, and it was it was performing very well. However, what we've now started to see is once again against the forces that are capable of dealing with these kind of threats, like Iran, and in Pakistan's case, like India. It's not really, it doesn't really seem like it's like the best use of funds, because one of the biggest things, one of the biggest arguments people make for UAVs is like it's a low cost, low risk, smaller strike option. And that doesn't really stand true anymore. UAVs are becoming so prohibitively expensive. I believe the Indians paid like something like $100 million for an MQ-9 for the per MQ-9B. And obviously that includes a ton of support and systems and everything. But the point is like that's by no means cheap. A loss of those is going to sting. And now, especially if we look back, if we look at the Iran conflict with the US, we see that the US has kind of like rethought its criteria for the successor to the MQ-9. Actually, in part because the MQ-9A the US had, they're not in production anymore, and the US has lost a significant portion of their fleet to the point where they're considering buying them back from other service from other countries. And this has shaped like the US's next generation drone requirements quite a lot. And actually, we'll discuss that now. And this is what I was referring to earlier as well. Is it might not necessarily be the best idea to carry on going into these kind of like vulnerable UAVs, right? So if we look at like US Air Force's MQ Next, we'll just call it MQ Next drone requirement. So it's a follow up for the Reaper, and it the goal is now like a drone that is optimized for rapid, large-scale production. The parameters describe a UAS with a sub 1,000-mile range, 20 hours of endurance. But the key here is a required lifespan of only 100 missions. Now, this is a very significant point, and it kind of goes back to like the old like Soviet doctrine with like their fighter jets that they need to be disposable, right? So the US is now looking back to disposable type aircraft where it's not going to hurt to lose them. So with the next generation MQ-9, they're looking to go back to the original roots of like an expendable drone, but not necessarily one that's low capability, but one that is not going to sting to lose, right? And if we look at like the historical trajectory of drone procurement, the original value proposition for these UAVs, where they were cheap, expendable, and ideal for like dull and like dirty missions, ones where the risk is very significant. But now we see like as mission creep took over, and the requirements forces had for these drones increased. Just look at the Akinji. That thing is equipped with like every munition under the sun, equipped with every sensor under the sun. So it's a very good example of mission creep, right? You've got requirements for like advanced sensors, heavier payloads, SATCOM, defensive suites, all of the stuff. It meant an increase in costs. They skyrocketed. Size as well, right? People tend to say like UAVs are smaller, cheaper, blah, blah, blah. But a lot of these UAVs are like bigger than something like a King Air, which is not a small aircraft by any means. And what was meant to be an affordable alternative to like a manned aircraft ended up rivaling manned aircraft in prices anyway. And, when a drone costs tens of millions, it's no longer like that expendable tool that people that was originally envisioned. It was kind of more like the positioning is now they're a high value asset and not necessarily attritable, which is very against what the original concept was behind these. And the reality check with Iran was that they're not survivable in contested airspace. And this was also a reality check that was seen in Ukraine as well after the initial couple of days and months and whatnot. We saw that they're not very survivable. And the Ukrainians ended up kind of using them as bait as well in certain attacks, like against the Moskva, for example. And the catalyst to, as I said, the catalyst to returning back to like attritable UAVs has been the reality of high intensity conflict, which is, against the layered IADS, traditional mail drones are just not survivable. And we've been saying this about the Akinji as well for a while, is that we hope to God that the Pakistan Air Force isn't procuring these for use against India, because it's just not going to work. It's a sitting duck, right? While the US Air Force utilized MQ-9s for ISR and deep strike work in Iranian airspace, the attrition was significant. They lost at least 24 Reapers, not mentioning, any previous losses in places like Yemen. And replacing these airframes is just not possible, right? They just don't make them anymore. The US Air Force did not order more. So General Atomics shut down the production line. Now, obviously, you can say, well, they still produce the MQ-9 in the Bravo variant, but the Bravo variant is not like the Alpha, right? It's like a Super Hornet to Hornet type thing. The MQ-9B is larger, more capable. The MQ-9B is like the epitome of mission creep, right? So if we look at now the future sort of idea behind MQ Next, let's call it, the US basically accepted that heavy drone losses are a certainty in conflict against regional actors and peer adversaries, particularly someone like China, for example. And the future of like unmanned combat is now a new, a different concept, like back to the original idea, like low cost, attritable, and it's kind of like reality. It's kind of focusing on like three main things: is you want the engineering to be disposable, right? You by lowering your lifespan to something like 100 missions, you can bypass the expensive materials and the rigorous testing needed to hit like 10,000 flight hours, for example. You can go for lower cost engines that aren't necessarily designed to last 10, 20,000 hours, or, the bar becomes a lot lower in terms of cost and also manufacturing difficulty. And that's the key here, is they need to be easy to manufacture as well, scale up. So designing something that only needs to last maybe, 3, 4, 500 hours, or maybe 1,000 hours, or 2,000 hours, the capability and the engineering behind that is going to be very different to something that needs to last 20, 30, 40,000. And the other thing is you want some, the other thing was they also had a requirement for a minimum endurance of 20 hours. And that's quite vital for theaters like the Pacific, where now they're able to flood with the new low-cost drones. They're able to flood the theater with a ton of these low-cost aircraft and not worry about losing them. There was only a limited number of MQ-9s. And the MQ-9s, if we say they go forever, they end up procuring MQ-9Bs. Those are $100 million a pop are not cheap, but they aren't something which you can absolutely flood the theater with for persistent ISR, right? And the other thing is, like, you're gonna make sacrifices here. And the sacrifice is that the ability to produce rapidly, the idea behind the rapid production and the low cost was that you just absorb the losses, right? You're kind of using them as an actually disposable asset, which is what we can't do at the moment. You can't actually use an Akinci as a disposable asset or an MQ-9 because they're so expensive that it's probably cheaper to use your manned aircraft as a disposable asset. However, obviously you've got the merit, the positives, in the sense that they are unmanned and whatnot. So the risk is lower in that sense. But now with all this stuff, low cost doesn't mean low capability, right? And I think the best way forward for attritable low, not necessarily low cost, but like UAV that's not going to sting if you lose it is, low observability is key, right? That's always been the requirement. I think General Atomics had put out like a graphic of their MQ Next rendition, which was a flying wing, a low observable flying wing. And I think that's quite key here is low observability, but also commercially available off the shelf solutions, particularly mission systems and all that sort of stuff. But, we've seen other designs like the XQ-58, the MQ, the Ghost Bat rather, which has modular payload systems, right? So it's, you can swap out the fancy kit for other more mission relevant stuff. So you don't necessarily have to carry all these advanced sensors, like something like an Akinci. If you want to slap a radar to it for, anti-ship strikes, you're going to still carry the $4 million electro-optical system. Basically, what you're looking for is a low observable, what the US is effectively going to be looking for is a low observable, very easy to produce, limited lifespan type UAV, which they can absorb the losses of. And I think this is something that the Pakistan Air Force needs to pay attention to as well in terms of its strike plans. Is maybe, and this is back to what we were discussing initially, is maybe stuff like the Akinci and, Wing Lung series isn't the way forward. That something like the Kızılelma, but maybe like a dumbed down version, or a 2 or 3 ton UCAV it could be the way forward. Something that's easy to produce, produced based off of pre-existing systems. Like for example, you could use JF-17 systems as part of it. To be able to produce something which is expendable, which is actually expendable, unlike something like a Wing Lung or a Akinci.
I agree, and I can see how the NQ Next idea is also, again, like it really does remind me of that conversation we had earlier in the episode about, the PAF arguably should be pursuing like a 2 to 3 ton loyal wingman design, specifically around these concepts where you aim for essentially a lower cost, you aim for simplicity. The idea is, again, these drones are not meant to last for like a 15-20 year cycle. You do expect them to lose them at some point. And I think it also, in a very, maybe in an inadvertent way, but if you were to openly say we're going to invest in these drones, right, we're expecting a 5 to 10 year life cycle, the whole point is that we want to use them. It's sort of like indirect signaling that you're basically readying yourself for a war front, right? Like your entire, like not your entire, but let's say a big chunk of your procurement strategy is geared on the next fight and the next fight happening potentially soon. So you're basically tuning your assets to not, like, you're not assuming that your assets are going to last for like 20, 50, like 20, 30 years. Rather, you're thinking in like 5 year intervals, basically. And I think that is the optimal direction, because again, when I look at least, I mean, we don't know about the MQ Next, how that'll evolve. We know US military procurement programs tend to also suffer from mission creep as well, quite a bit. But if I just take the initial specification requirements on face value, it seems like what they're really asking for is like a variation of the CCA drones that the industry's already developed. So it could be that, you could see a situation that, those who didn't get selected for the previous round, like, General Dynamics and what have you, they can come in and offer another comparable solution, right? And I mean, to be honest, I can even see these requirements being even simpler than that of the CCA options. Basically, I think the emphasis here is basically, look, at the base minimum, we need a stealthy design with an air-breathing engine, basically, is what it sounds like. Because even, like, for example, it says here, at launch is like what, target launch to collection range of 200 kilometers with an objective of about 1,500 kilometers, a loiter time threshold of about 4 hours with an objective of about 20 hours. So it's not far from what they've already been producing. It sounds like they just want like a different variation of it. So I think, it's very interesting, because I would argue, like, I think you alluded to it, but I would argue that the Kızılelma and the Anka 3 they exceed these requirements. So these are not exactly what the U.S. Air Force itself is looking for. They want a simpler design. And I think that's the big opportunity here. Like, hey, if you're Baykar Group and the PAF, if you're Baykar Group and you're putting this investment into Pakistan, this might be the area, if you want to develop something that could be produced at scale within Pakistan in a very enduring way without, a potential production stall like you have with the JF-17, it would be actually this 2 to 3 ton UAV design.
And just to touch on that, actually, I just came to mind. Quite an interesting potential option to explore would be the K-2, I believe, which is like a TB2 derived loitering munition. It's bloody massive, but you can tell that they've made a lot of changes to make it truly attritable, and just get easier to produce. Like, it's very clear that they're reusing TB2 molds, for example. And that seems to be, from the outset, designed to be very easy to produce, relatively cheap. I don't think it's going to be cheap, but relatively cheap and genuinely attritable. And I don't think it's a great loitering munition design to start with. I don't think it's what is needed. We see these large loitering munitions are very rarely survivable. They don't very rarely do what they need to. But what I do think it could be a potentially very interesting option is developing that into our version of the MQ next, is turning that into an attritable strike option or a attritable ISR option.
So I do want to call one interesting thing. So back in 2022, NESCOM through GIDS had released their future roadmap, and a lot of those programs that started coming into fruition, like the low MADS air defense system, the Shepherd 3, obviously, and quite a few others, right? But there was in the initial release of that roadmap, there used to be a Group 5 UAV design. And then a few weeks later, they removed it. And I think even NESCOM at a certain level understood that this idea of pursuing larger and larger turboprop powered drones was going to reach a ceiling. And they decided that instead of going for this very relatively complex and very high cost system that will at best be procured in very small numbers, they need to make a pivot somewhere. And, the pivot that they're best equipped to make is in this sort of area where you get into the 2 to 3 ton UCAV area, because they're, definitely compared to NASTP. Like NASTP is nowhere close in this, but they are the best equipped within Pakistan right now to get there because they've already done a lot of the legwork through the cruise missile programs, right? Through the Rad, through the Harba, through the Babar, like all these programs. So they've developed a very good base of expertise for, like, basically, let's say, semi-complex air vehicles. Let's just call them that. Semi-complex jet-powered air vehicles. Like that's like the foundation of all these like attributable UCAV designs. Not a one-to-one connection, but a lot of the guts. Like if you notice, like if you read back at the Valkyrie's like initial early development stuff, the designers were talking about how they basically started from target drones and cruise missiles and worked their way up to the to the Valkyrie design. And it's very similar for Andro. If you look at how Andro's approaching its, like if you look at Andro's product, what is it? It's like, again, cruise missiles, loitering munitions, and drones. So the point being is that this is the kind of competency you're, if you want, like the companies that are working fast and producing these sorts of UCAV solutions typically come from this sort of background. And NESCOM is so well aligned for that that would surprise me if they don't have a UCAV design underworks along these concepts. Like it wouldn't surprise me if we see them come up with an MQ next type solution in the next few years, specifically to fill out this requirement. And the way to scale it is, as you alluded to, it's like, you would want to replace your Shepherd, medium altitude, long endurance piston slash turboprop powered drones with large numbers of these that'll just take on a swing mix of reconnaissance, targeting support, and of course, attack and loyal wingman stuff. And then you can produce them over time, over a long period of time. But it wouldn't surprise me. It'd be very interesting to see. Yeah, it's a bit of redundancy here, but it would be interesting to see like how these two forces, NASTP and Baykar on one end and NESCOM on the other, sort of approach this. I don't think NESCOM is just going to suddenly stop working. Now, it could be possible that NESCOM is pivoting more into like these conventional ballistic missiles and stuff. That's true. Then that would probably take a lot of resources, but I don't see them stopping their air vehicle work. Like I think something else is coming. So Arslan, any concluding thoughts?
Nothing other than I can foresee the comments saying the episodes are too long, stop making them this long. We can't sit there and listen to them. And I just wanted to touch on that just a little bit, is the amount these kind of conversations can't be condensed down into 5-10 minute video episodes, right? Like the amount of stuff we have to talk about to bring you the in-depth episodes and the thoughts and the context behind all these things takes a lot of time. And so yeah, it means you get very, very long episodes which you might not be able to watch all in one go, but it also takes us a very long time to make them, right? And we know, it's something we're doing because we enjoy it, but also because we want to be able to provide the best quality and also the most in-depth and detailed thoughts we can, because you're not going to find that elsewhere. And I think, Bilal, you've now started cutting them into more bite-sized chunks as well now.
Yeah, absolutely. We are chunking them down. So we're producing basically like we're sort of repurposing the long episodes into shorter clips. It's like 10, 15 minutes where we just focus on one of the topics. So if you're interested in the drone conversation, you can just go into that and not worry about anything else. So with that, I'll conclude this week's episode. So once again, Arslan, thanks for joining me.
No.
And once again, to our listeners, thanks for joining us. And we hope to see you next week. So take care. Bye.
Bye.